Hey folks, welcome back to the Tiny Fibre Studio. I'm Bex, and in this video we're going to talk about measuring your yarn in wraps per inch, or WPI. We'll discuss how to take a measurement in a couple of different ways and talk about the pros and cons of each method and some of the things that you can use wraps per inch for. And ultimately we'll aim to answer the question, is wraps per inch actually useful? This is part of a series on project planning and record keeping as requested by my Patreon members. So if you want to make sure that you catch the rest of the series, don't forget to subscribe. And to my lovely Patreon members, don't forget that you get ad-free access to this video via Patreon as a thank you for supporting my work. Wraps per inch is a way to measure the diameter of our yarn. It's considered to be a pretty fundamental measurement in hand spinning. But it does have its drawbacks. We'll get to those drawbacks later, but for now, what is wraps per inch? Because yarn's a bit inconsistent and kind of squishy, it's difficult to measure a single strand precisely. So one common way to measure it is to count how many pieces of that yarn you could have lying next to each other in a 1 inch or 2.5 centimetre space. And that number is your wraps per inch, or wraps per 2.5 centimetres if you're working in metric. You can measure the wraps per inch of your singles or your plyback samples to help you stay consistent while you're spinning. And you can keep records of it to help you decide how to spin and ply similar yarns in the future. You can also measure your finished plied handspun to compare it against commercial yarn weights. And if you're a weaver, you can use it to help you determine your set, how many ends per inch you'll have in your reed. You might even be able to use it to work out how thick to spin your singles in order to end up with a specific size of plied yarn, but that is a deep dive for later in the video. There are a few different ways to measure wraps per inch depending on the tools that you have available. Let me know in the comments if there's a particular method that you prefer to use. The first option just requires a ruler or tape measure with inch markings, or you could use 2.5 centimetres as your measuring distance, and you'll also need something to wrap your yarn around. It could be a pencil, a knitting needle, a dowel, the ruler itself. Pretty much anything sturdy will work, but it's useful if it's a bit grippy so that the yarn doesn't slide around too much. You can also buy or make something like this, which has a 1 inch notch cut out. But I like to wrap first and measure later because it means that I'm not subconsciously trying to aim for a particular figure. I'm going to use a dowel that I've just cut a little notch into. I'll trap the end of the yarn in the notch, or you could tape the end of the yarn down instead, and I'll rotate the dowel so that the yarn winds on around it from the side. To make the measurement as accurate as possible, I need to lay each wrap right next to the previous one, making sure that I don't stretch the yarn. I want the wraps to be nicely lined up next to each other with no gaps in between, but without packing them in tight or overlapping them. When I finish wrapping, I just measure an inch and count the number of wraps. So this is 11 wraps per inch. If you're wondering why I specifically said that I was winding the yarn on from the side, wrapping the yarn around the dowel from the end like this adds or removes twist, as you can see from this example, where the last few wraps have almost no twist at all. That will slightly change the yarn and it could make it a bit thicker or thinner as a result. Some people follow a rule of packing to refusal. That is, using this kind of gauge and packing the wraps of yarn in there until it refuses to take any more without the strands overlapping. Your experience may vary, but I don't find that that gives me accurate results for comparing against yarn weights or working out ends per inch. As an example, this yarn that I originally measured as 11 wraps per inch, I was able to get up to 27 wraps per inch by packing to refusal. That's the difference between Aran weight, which is what this commercial yarn is classed as, and sock weight, according to the Craft Yarn Council. It's quite a big difference. If you ever see a wraps per inch measurement quoted in a book, a magazine, online, and you think, that seems like an improbably high number of wraps per inch, given the photo that you're looking at, it might be that they've used the packing to refusal method to measure the wraps per inch. There is, however, something really interesting about this packing to refusal method, but I'm going to save that for another video because it goes hand in hand with another measurement. Let's talk pros and cons. On the upside, the wrapping method does give you a specific figure, even for very fine yarns, and that might come in handy for some of the calculations that we'll talk about later. But on the downside, the finer the yarn you're working with, the more time consuming it is to wind, and the greater the length of yarn that you'll need to actually get that measurement. So if you're trying to check your singles in the middle of your spinning, you could be there for a while. If you're measuring a very fine yarn, you could just wind 1/2 inch, count the wraps in that, and then multiply by 2, or for super fine yarns, wind 1/4 inch and multiply by 4. You can also buy specific tools for measuring lace weight, like this one, where you wrap a certain number of times. In this case, 20 times for cobweb, 10 times for lace, and there are little lines to tell you how many wraps per inch that equates to. So I wrapped this yarn 10 times, and it came up about halfway between the 20 and 30 wraps per inch lines. But that doesn't give me an exact figure, so I'd have to guesstimate that it's somewhere between around 23 to 27. I could measure the gap between the lines just to double check. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if the yarn that you're measuring is not particularly consistent or is very thick, 1 inch might not be enough to get an accurate measurement. For those chunkier yarns, it's a good idea to count the number of wraps in 2 or more inches, and then divide the number of wraps by the number of inches, just to get a more accurate result. But the biggest problem I have with the wrapping method is that even if I try really hard to wind consistently, I could do it 5 times in a row and get 5 different measurements, depending on whether I'm slightly stretching the yarn out as I wind or packing the wraps together a bit more tightly. So if you're using this method and you'd like to get the most precise measurement possible, you need to try to be consistent in your winding technique and perhaps measure a few times and settle on the average. Option 2 is the control card method. They're known by various different names, including control cards, spinner's gauges, yarn gauges, and so on, and they're a reference guide marked with lots of lines. The lines correspond to the number of wraps per inch. For example, the 8 wraps per inch line is 1/8 of an inch thick. So if I take my piece of yarn and hold it over the lines without any stretching, I can see which line my yarn is closest in size to. Different people might have different ways of deciding which line is closest. I look for something where the only part of the line visible is in the dips between the ply bumps, if it's a plied yarn or a ply back sample. The rest of the yarn covers the line. In this case, when I hold my yarn over it, I can see that the yarn is most similar in size to the 6 wraps per inch line. If I'm measuring singles, I'll look for the widest line that's completely covered by the yarn. If you find it easier, try holding the edge of the control card perpendicular to the yarn and look for a line which seems to be the same width as the yarn. While they all do the same thing, some gauges have specific features that I find helpful. None of these are sponsored or gifted, and I'll put links to all of the tools in the video description and the pinned comment. Some gauges are transparent and allow you to hold the yarn under the guide instead of on top and see whether any of the yarn peeks out from the top or bottom of the line. This one also has a little gap in the line as well, so if it looks like there's no difference between my yarn in the middle and the lines on either side, I know I've got a good measurement. This particular one was made by a company that went out of business about 10 years ago, but I know that HipStrings currently make a very similar one under their own brand and also a Daedalus branded one as well. Other gauges have grooves instead of just printed lines, which can make it easier to measure finer yarns. This one by Lumigrafika has a really wide range of lines from 4 to 60 wraps per inch. With finer yarns, I'll see if it fits in the groove, check if there's any wiggle room, and repeat as necessary until I find the groove that it fits into snugly. As long as you're not stretching or compressing the yarn, it makes it a lot harder to lie to yourself about your spinning. Either it fits in the groove or it doesn't. And the more tactile nature of those grooves might be helpful if you find it difficult to see the lines on a regular gauge. The grooves are less helpful when you're comparing thicker yarns because only part of the yarn sits in the groove, so you'll be back to using the lines or the wrapping method to judge those. They do have a newer version of this particular gauge which has more contrasting lines, and that would definitely make it easier to see. Control cards often have other features like a quick reference for the yarn weights, a 1 inch cutout where you can use the wrapping method, or count the twists per inch, which I'll cover in another video. Most of them also have somewhere to tie on a plyback sample so that you can have that as a reference to compare to as well. And for consistency throughout a project, that's definitely something that I would recommend. So what about the pros and cons of the control card method? On the plus side, control cards only require a very small amount of yarn, a few inches, to take their measurement from. So it's quicker and much easier to check while you're spinning to see if your singles or plyback samples are still on track. But that can also be a bit misleading. We'll come back to that in a second. The downside to this method is that there isn't a line for every single number, so it's hard to be absolutely precise, especially with finer yarns, because there tends to be quite a big gap between the fine lines. Most of them go from around 30 to 60, with only one line in between. Before we get into talking about the potential pitfalls of wraps per inch, what do you actually do with the measurement once you know what it is? The first thing that I do is to make a note of it. I write it down along with all of my other project notes for future reference. I also note down specifically whether I was measuring the singles, the plyback sample, freshly plied, or the completely wet finished plied yarn. You can also look at a wraps per inch table to work out roughly what the equivalent yarn weight is for knitting, crochet, and so on. I say roughly because different sources don't agree with each other on how many wraps per inch a particular weight of yarn should be. To work out ends per inch for weaving, the rule of thumb is that for plain weave, also known as tabby, your wraps per inch divided by 2 gives you your ends per inch, while for twill it's 2/3 of your wraps per inch. Now, I did say that there were some pitfalls to the wraps per inch unit of measurement as a whole. We've talked about some already, but here are a few more. First, you're only measuring a small amount of yarn in comparison to the whole skein, especially if you're using a control card. Let's take one of my earliest handspun skeins as an example. Let's say that back in 2011, Past Bex was aiming for a DK weight yarn, so something in the region of 12 to 15 wraps per inch. Well, would you look at that, it's spot on. But if you look at the whole skein, there is no way that that's DK weight throughout. So let's try it again with a bit more average part of the skein. That's around 6 wraps per inch, so roughly a bulky weight. So the entire skein probably averages out somewhere around Aran weight. The point is, handspun, by its very nature, is likely to have variations of diameter throughout. So unless your skein is super consistent, to get an accurate wraps per inch measure, you really need to take multiple measurements from thicker and thinner sections and average them out. Another thing to keep in mind is that yarn will often bloom or poof up when it's washed after spinning, and if it does, it won't be the same as your wraps per inch when you originally spun or plied it. So if you're trying to spin a specific thickness of yarn, you'll need to take that into account. And then we come on to the big question. Is wraps per inch actually useful? As we've seen, handspun is likely to vary in diameter throughout. It's often squishy and stretchy, and in some cases we are trying to measure microscopically small differences in thickness with the naked eye, so we may not measure it exactly the same way every single time. With all of that taken into account, I think we have to accept that wraps per inch is a pretty ballpark figure. So is it useful for understanding how your yarn will work in a project? All wraps per inch does is tell you the diameter of the yarn. Obviously, it's useful to know during spinning whether you're anywhere close to the weight of yarn that you want. If you wanted a sock yarn, but it's currently closer to Aran, you might need to have a rethink. But even if two yarns are the same diameter, it doesn't mean that they're going to behave the same way. They might not even knit or crochet to the same stitch or row gauge. Many factors like fibre composition, the number of plies, the amount of twist, and the style of drafting can all affect the way that a yarn works up. And in any case, if your goal is to use your handspun in a knitting, weaving, or crochet project, wraps per inch is no substitute for making a swatch and wet finishing it to ensure that you're going to get a fabric with the characteristics you want in terms of things like drape, springiness, durability, and so on. But recording the wraps per inch of my singles unfinished plied yarn and the finished yarn give me a really useful reference point that I can use in the future to either replicate this yarn or help me decide how to spin a similar fibre to get the yarn that I want. Speaking of which, an interesting question that comes up a lot when you talk about wraps per inch is, if I'm spinning a 2-ply, does that mean that my singles should be half the size of my desired plied yarn? For example, if you're intending for your final 2-ply yarn to be 14 wraps per inch, does that mean that your singles should be twice as thin, so 28 wraps per inch? Maybe? A 2-ply yarn isn't 2 strands of yarn lying next to each other. It's 2 strands of singles intertwined with each other. And in the process of plying, you're also changing the twist, letting air in, and then there's the poof potential during finishing. So there are a lot of different variables to take into account. Some highly experienced spinners have tried to put an exact figure on how to calculate this change from singles to plied yarn. Anne Field's figures from Spinning Wool Beyond the Basics suggest that if you wanted your plied yarn to be 14 wraps per inch, you'd multiply that by 1.5, which is 21. So you'd spin your singles at 21 wraps per inch. But while Anne's suggested multiplier was 1.5, Mabel Ross's in the Essentials of Hand Spinning is an average of 1.77, which is 25 wraps per inch singles. That's not a huge difference, but in a blog post, Abby Frankemont's samples work out to a multiplier of 2.21, which is 31 wraps per inch. So now we're 10 wraps per inch on from where we started. I don't think 2 times is a bad starting point, but honestly there are just so many other variables in this, like fibre type, twist angle, twist per inch, drafting method. I think it's near enough impossible to put an exact figure on it that would work for every yarn and every spinner, which is probably why many other expert spinners choose not to touch this conversation with a 10-foot barge pole. If you're interested in exploring this further, I would suggest keeping a record of the wraps per inch from your singles and the finished plied yarn. The same formula works regardless of the number of plies. Just divide the singles wraps per inch by that of the finished plied yarn, and that will give you the multiplier. You might find that there's a magic number that works for you, and if there is, let me know in the comments. Just out of interest, for a 2-ply, my average multiplier is around 2.3, and for 3-ply, it's around 2.6. If you found this video helpful, a like, comment and subscribe is very much appreciated. And if you'd like to support the channel financially, the links are in the description and the pinned comment. Thank you so much to everyone who helps support my work. I will see you again in the next video.